Hi, my name is Christina Norman, and today I will be analyzing the poem The Garden of Love by William Blake. To begin, the poem is comprised of three stanzas with a rhyme scheme of A, B, C, B, and the final stanza shifts to a non-rhyming pattern of A, B, C, D. However, in the final two lines, there are two rhyming patterns, which I will go over when we review the third stanza. A surface reading of the poem depicts the speaker entering a garden strewn with flowers. The speaker witnesses a chapel as it is built in the midst of his garden, but he cannot enter it. So he turns away from the chapel and back to the Garden of Love. This time, however, when he turns back, instead of the abundant flowers that he originally had, he finds a graveyard with tombstones and priests walking in and out. A more in-depth reading of the poem reveals an allegory about the conflicting desires of the flesh and the demands of a Christian morality and a Christian life. In the first stanza, line 1, the speaker says, quote, "I went to the garden of love," end quote. The garden of love in this instance is capitalized to indicate a sacred place of importance, a name um, that is very representative of the speaker. In lines 2 through 4, the speaker goes on to say, quote, "And saw what I never had seen, a chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green." This passage is reminiscent of a child's first encounter with the church. In this context, the garden symbolizes the speaker's innocence and youth and the joys and the freedoms of childhood. In the second stanza, the speaker goes on to say, quote, "And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love, so that many sweet flowers bore." Excuse me, that so many sweet flowers bore. Lines 5 through 8. In these lines, the speaker refers to the Ten Commandments of the Bible, which are, from common knowledge, 10 rules for living an obedient Christian life. Because the speaker notes that the chapel doors are closed to him, it's evident that the speaker feels alienated due to the rigidity of church doctrines, so much so that he is unable to draw close to God. Therefore, the speaker turns away from the church in his heart and in his mind to find the peace and contentment that he once felt in the garden of love as a child. However, in stanza 3, we come to understand that the speaker is no longer a child, and the tone of the poem shifts dramatically from one of nostalgia to one of despondency. In line 12, it starts, quote, "And I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires." Here is where I mentioned that rather than the ABCB rhyme scheme, it's ABCD, and on the two last lines we have rhyming patterns gowns and rounds and briars and desires, which is rather interesting. It's a nice closure of the poem. The speaker in these lines, the speaker's garden no longer resembles the overabundant green lushness of his youth. Um, in in these lines, the graves and the tombstones, these symbols of death, symbolize the speaker's death of innocence, loss of innocence. He can no longer return to the freedom of his youth. The melancholy lines depict the conflict within the speaker as he grapples with a divided conscience. Should he remain faithful to the church, which plays such an important role in his society of that time, or should he follow his own ideas and his own paths and his own um, beliefs? Furthermore, the black clad priests portray the ever demanding, guilt inducing role of the church, who the speaker feels is only present to steal his joys and desires, as said in line 12. In conclusion, the chief message of this poem is the destructive nature of church doctrine on a young mind. The church is depicted as rather bleak, uninviting, and oppressive. And the poem serves just as a general warning against religious dogma. However, it's important to keep in mind that this is all in the beliefs and opinions of William Blake. So, with that, I want to thank you for listening to me and invite you to ask any questions regarding my interpretation of this poem. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye bye.